So I was interested to see that Hannah said she'd arranged her book by past, present, future, because that's actually what I've done with my talk. I'm going to cover a few 100 million years in about 20 minutes, so we'll see how that goes. But there's a big time leap, so we should be okay. So a few 100 million years ago, the Earth was very different. It was the Carboniferous Period. Oxygen levels were very high. There were dragonflies with meter wingspans and huge forests over swamps. And what happened when these trees died? They ended up in the swamps and they didn't rot. They became fossilized and ended up as coal under the rocks. And similarly, at the same time, tiny sea creatures became oil and gas that we left alone for a long, long time. So I'm going to jump forward a few 100 million years to the 1820s when Joseph Fourier, who was a French scientist, he was thinking about why Earth is the temperature that it is based on the amount of energy it gets from the sun. And he realized that actually, everything being equal, the Earth should actually be minus 15 degrees, when actually, on average, it's 14 degrees globally. So he realized there was something going on and realized that our atmosphere actually keeps us warm. So he discovered back in the 1820s the greenhouse gas effect. What he didn't know was what it was in the atmosphere that's warming us up. And that wasn't until the 1860s, about 10 years after the Industrial Revolution had started and we'd started burning way more fossil fuels. John Tindal, an Irish physicist working in London, discovered that carbon dioxide, water, and methane are all greenhouse gases, and are in the air. So he worked out what gases there were contributing. In the 1890s, Swedish researcher Svante Arrhenius was thinking about volcanoes, and volcanoes spew out greenhouse gases, and he wondered what would happen if that stopped and if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere halved. But then somebody said to him, well, what if that flipped? And what if we doubled the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, maybe by burning coal? What would happen? And he calculated that would, if we doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, that would raise temperatures by about 5 degrees. And that's not too different to the amount scientists think today would happen if we doubled carbon dioxide amounts. Their range is kind of more 2 to 4.5, 5 degrees. So doubling carbon dioxide sounds like a lot, but actually carbon dioxide only makes up today about 0.4% of our atmosphere. And before the Industrial Revolution, it made up just under 0.03% of our atmosphere. It was 280 parts per million. Now it's more than 400 parts per million. And we're increasing that by more than 2 parts per million per year. So we're heading towards that doubling. So this is carbon dioxide emissions for the last couple of 100 years. You can see they started to go up in the 1850s, so when that Industrial Revolution happened. And you can see also in blue, that's the industrialized world countries. And you can see that they were contributing the bulk in the early days. And then other countries have started to contribute more since the middle of the century. And China overtook the US in terms of emissions in 2007, but actually historically, the US has nearly double the carbon emissions of China to date. So this again is over the last 10,000 years, looking at carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see then that this spike here, just how steep that is happening, how fast that is happening in recent times. And that speed of change is a factor as well, because wildlife isn't having time to adapt. So now, today we know there are a few more greenhouse gases as well. Carbon dioxide that Tindal realised that comes from burning fossil fuels and from deforestation. Those are the main sources. And carbon dioxide is responsible for about half of the greenhouse gas effect. Methane is emitted by cattle and sheep burping, from gas pipeline leaks when we extract oil as well, and by rice paddy fields. Then there's nitrous oxide that comes from artificial fertilizer use and various other pollution through manufacturing, and fluorocarbons used in industrial processes and in our refrigeration and air conditioners. So fast forward a bit more to the 1980s. This is when temperature rise really started to become apparent. At the same time, there was a campaign by many oil companies to cast doubt on climate change science. And this is discussed in an excellent book by Harvard historian Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their book Merchants of Doubt, which is now film as well. And they found that the oil companies were using the same PR firms that muddied the link between cancer and smoking. So it was strategy to delay action. And in fact, it wasn't until 2007 that the UN's IPCC body, which is about 2,000 scientists, commissioned to do reports. And they, in 2007, came out and said that global warming was unequivocal. But the IPCC works by consensus, so their reports are quite conservative. So climate change, as I'm sure you all know, has big effects on all sorts of factors. Temperature and rainfall extremes, which in turn affect food supplies, and crop yields go down if it's too hot for particular crops. Melting of ice that's on land, so on Greenland and Antarctica, that then adds to the amount of water in the oceans, and the oceans water also gets hotter and expands, so that adds to sea level rise as well. It affects freshwater availability for people. Coastal areas, as Hannah mentioned, going to be underwater, some of them, and that's particularly worrisome if you're a Pacific small island or in Bangladesh, or in fact on any coastal area. It's bad for human health. In some areas, they think people will no longer be able to work outside during the day because if temperature is in the 40s, human body just can't do physical work at that kind of level. And it's an issue for human security as well if you need to move or there's conflicts over supplies of food and water. And as I mentioned before, it's also problematic for wildlife, which doesn't have time to adapt. Some wildlife can move a certain extent. Plants can't move typically, or can't move very far or very fast. And there may also not be any suitable habitat for wildlife to move to. For example, if you're gradually moving up a mountain to stay cool, what happens when you get to the top of the mountain? So fast forwarding now to some of the political action that's been taken on climate change. In 1992, countries came together at the Earth Summit in Rio. Excuse me. And that led ultimately to the Kyoto Protocol, which set legally binding targets for developed countries. And those ran out in 2012. And there were negotiations in Copenhagen in 2009, but they didn't go that well, and legally binding targets didn't result. And in 2015, countries came together again for another big meeting. There's a meeting every year. In Paris in 2015, they agreed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees C, and with a target of 1.5 degrees, or efforts to pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees. The US did join in this time. Then when Trump was there in 2019, they pulled out, and now Biden has taken them back into the agreement. So that's promising. So last year, November 2020, we were due to have COP26, another follow-on meeting to Paris, was due to be held in Glasgow. That got postponed because of the coronavirus, but it's due to go ahead in November. Developing countries are very, very keen that it should be an in-person meeting, so they're not held back by lack of access to virtual facilities. So that arrangements are trying to be put in place now. Here, countries make individual commitments. They say what their nationally determined contributions will be. If you add all those up at the moment, the temperature rise that would result is well over 3 degrees. So that's too high. The UK are heading the talks, and we've said that we hope this will be the COP that consigns coal to history, which would be excellent because coal is one of the most carbon emitting fossil fuels there is. And also we can only burn to stay within our carbon budget to keep temperatures low. We can only burn 1/5 of the fossil fuel reserves that we know about. So that very much limits fossil fuel burning. They'll also be discussing aid for climate mitigation and adaptation for developing countries, because historically the developed countries have emitted so many more emissions. Developing countries who are often suffering more because they're in generally hotter regions anyway, they're in the tropics typically, and have fewer resources to deal with climate change, so to adapt their processes. So they're suffering more from a problem that they haven't caused, and typically carbon footprint per person, per head, is much lower in developing countries as well. So the more developed countries have committed in previous years to finance mitigation, so cutting emissions and adaptation, ways to deal with climate change that's already built in for developing countries. But to date, we haven't always provided all that money that we've said we would. So in COP, they'll also be talking about nature-based solutions, so tree planting or peat restoration to lock in carbon into the ground, finance solutions for developing countries, and I'm going to talk a bit about net zero. So the UK has committed to a target of cutting our carbon emissions by 78% by 2030 and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So net zero means any emissions you are still making because you haven't been able to change technology or the way that you do it to cut that completely to zero. Then you try and use negative emissions technologies, either carbon capture and storage, so taking carbon from a power station as you emit it and burying it underground, or through tree planting to then counterbalance the emissions that you are emitting and bring you to net zero. That some people are arguably using that as a way of delaying emission cuts that they do now and passing the buck down to future generations. So whilst we do need to do some negative emissions technologies, it's potentially usable as an excuse for not acting now. So that's something to be aware of and keep an eye on. And the future very much depends on us, on these negotiations, what governments do, what individuals do, and how we take it forward. So that we're going to go from the future to SGR's work on the military. These are figures that my colleague Stuart Parkinson put together. So he found that the global military carbon footprint is greater than that of Italy, so a few percent of the world's total. The US Armed Forces carbon emissions are greater than those of Argentina. And crucially, there's not much requirement on militaries to be transparent about how much they're emitting or to reduce it. They're typically not included in government carbon reduction targets. So that's an area that needs pressure applied. Then I'll just talk very quickly, as well as the military carbon footprint, we have a science oath for the climate, where we're asking scientists and engineers to sign a commitment to change their individual behaviour, to put their money where their mouth is, in a way, and show just how important acting on climate change is. And also they'll commit to pushing for systemic change, because individual change by itself isn't enough. Emitting carbon is built into our systems as well, so we need to change that. And we're also writing to professional science and engineering organisations about their investments in arms and fossil fuels, asking them to stop. So that's it from me, and thank you for listening.